The Daguerreotype, a mirror with a memory, was not known for forgiveness. It captured the unvarnished truth of a moment, fixing the sitter's soul to a silvered plate with merciless accuracy. But in the autumn of 1841, in a secluded farmhouse miles from any proper town, a single exposure would capture a truth that no one present had witnessed. It recorded the quiet dignity of a rural family, yes, but it also held an impossible horror within its polished surface, a dark reflection that suggested some truths are not meant to be seen. The resulting image would become a cursed artifact, a silent testament to a hidden deformity not of the flesh, but of reality itself, proving that the camera can sometimes see what the human eye refuses to. If you are drawn to the shadows that linger at the edge of old photographs, and this is your first time in these halls, subscribe to our archive and help us piece together the histories that were meant to be forgotten. The man who would unlatch this quiet horror was named Silas Blackwood, an itinerant daguerreotypist by trade. He was a man of science and precision, one of a new breed of artisans who worked with light and chemistry rather than paint and canvas. His journey to the Abbott farm had been an arduous one, a 3-day ordeal along rutted tracks that threatened to ruin the delicate glass plates and bottled chemicals secured in the back of his wagon. The commission had come by way of a letter, penned in a surprisingly neat hand by the farmer, Mr. Elias Abbott. The letter spoke of a desire to immortalize his family, to have a permanent record of their presence in the world, a sentiment Silas understood. His profession was, after all, the business of cheating time. The farmhouse itself, when he finally reached it, was a stark and lonely structure, set against a backdrop of skeletal trees and fields already harvested for the year. It was a place that seemed to be holding its breath. Mr. Elias Abbott greeted him at the door. He was a tall, gaunt man whose face seemed carved from the very wood of his property. He moved with a stiff deliberation, a man unaccustomed to ceremony. He introduced his wife, Mistress Ada Abbott, a woman whose exhaustion was etched into the fine lines around her eyes, though she held herself with a quiet, resilient posture. There were 3 children. The eldest, a boy of about 10 named Samuel, stood with his father's stoicism, his hands held rigidly at his sides. And then there were the twins, Elspeth and Anne, 2 girls of perhaps 7 years, identical in their plain, dark dresses and the unnerving stillness with which they regarded the visitor. Mistress Abbott offered Silas a glass of cool water, a simple gesture of hospitality that seemed to cost her a significant effort. He noted a single humanizing detail in the otherwise severe scene. The younger twin, Anne, was nervously twisting a loose bit of black thread at her cuff. Her one small betrayal of the rigid composure the family seemed determined to maintain. Silas explained that the process would take some time, that he would need to prepare the parlor for the sitting. Mr. Abbott simply nodded and said that they were patient people. Silas Blackwood began the meticulous, almost ritualistic process of his craft. He requested that the parlor's heavy curtains be drawn, plunging the room into a deep gloom. He allowed only a single, high window to remain uncovered, its pale morning light cutting a sharp, dusty beam through the air. This controlled illumination was essential. The parlor was a Spartan space, dominated by a dark wooden table and several stiff-backed chairs. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, but soon another, more astringent odor would join it. Silas unpacked his equipment with practiced care. There was the camera itself, a heavy box of polished mahogany and brass, which he mounted on its sturdy tripod. Then came the chemical boxes, a veritable apothecary of strange and volatile substances. He laid out his silver-plated copper sheets, his polishing buffs, and his vials of iodine and bromine. The process of preparing the plate was a delicate one, a secret art performed in near darkness. He had to sensitize the polished silver surface to light, a task that required him to expose it to the chemical fumes in a sealed box. The smell of the chemicals, sharp and metallic, began to fill the shuttered room, a sterile scent that felt alien in the rustic farmhouse. He worked in silence, his movements precise and economical. The family watched him from the doorway, their faces impassive, like figures in a tableau waiting for their artist to begin. When the plate was finally ready, a mirror-like surface now dangerously sensitive to the slightest touch of light, Silas arranged the family. He positioned them against a plain, dark blanket he had hung to serve as a backdrop. Mr. Abbott was seated, his posture unyielding. Mistress Abbott stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, though Silas noted there seemed to be no warmth in the gesture. The children were arranged in front. Samuel stood straight and tall, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the camera. The twins, Elspeth and Anne, were seated on a low stool before their parents. Silas adjusted their positions minutely, tilting a head here, straightening a shoulder there. He explained the necessity of absolute stillness. He informed them that the exposure would take several minutes, and that during that time, they must not move a muscle. He told them not even to blink if they could help it, as any movement would result in a blur, a ghosting of the image that would render the portrait a failure. The family listened with an unnerving placidity. They seemed to possess a preternatural capacity for stillness, as if they had been practicing for this moment for their entire lives. Silas retreated behind the camera, his head disappearing under the heavy black cloth. From within that small, dark world, he made his final adjustments to the focus, seeing the family inverted and dreamlike on the ground glass. They were pale and unsmiling, their anxious faces bathed in the cool, directional light. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking a slow, heavy second. He removed the lens cap. The exposure began. The light from the window streamed into the camera's dark chamber, carrying with it the silent, unmoving image of the Abbott family, and began the subtle chemical alchemy that would burn their likenesses onto the silver plate. The minutes stretched on, thick and suffocating. Silas could hear the faint, shallow breaths of the children. He could feel the immense weight of their collective stillness, the sheer force of will it took for 5 people to remain so perfectly frozen in time. The air in the room grew heavy, the chemical smell more pronounced. It felt less like a portrait sitting and more like a vigil. Through the oppressive silence, Silas found his mind wandering. He thought of the long journey back, of the other commissions that awaited him. Yet a small, intrusive thought pricked at the edge of his professional focus. There was something about the quality of the silence in this house, a profound and hollow quiet that seemed to absorb sound. It was an unnatural stillness, and for a moment, he felt a baseless, irrational sense of dread. He dismissed it as a fancy, a product of fatigue and the strange, solemn atmosphere of the parlor. When he judged that enough time had passed, he replaced the lens cap, the decisive click echoing loudly in the quiet room. He told the family they could relax. They did so without a word, their limbs seeming to unlock from a state of suspended animation. Silas carefully removed the plate holder from the camera and told them he would now develop the image. He required a space of complete darkness for this next, most critical step. Mr. Abbott directed him to a small, windowless pantry off the kitchen. The space was perfect. Inside, surrounded by shelves of preserved goods, Silas set up his mercury fuming box. This was the most dangerous part of the process, the part that had sent many a daguerreotypist to an early grave. He heated the mercury, allowing its toxic fumes to rise and develop the latent image on the plate. He worked by the dim orange glow of a safe light, his heart beating a steady rhythm of anticipation. This was the moment of revelation, when the ghost on the plate would either resolve into a clear, perfect likeness or dissolve into a foggy failure. He held the plate over the rising fumes, watching, waiting. Slowly, like a spirit manifesting in a dark mirror, the image began to appear. First, the highlights emerged, the pale ovals of the faces, the white of a collar. Then, the midtones and shadows filled in, giving the figures depth and form. Silas felt a surge of professional satisfaction. The image was sharp. The parents, Mr. and Mistress Abbott, were rendered with breathtaking clarity. Their stern, unsmiling faces stared back at him from the silvered surface, their likenesses perfect. The eldest son, Samuel, was also clear, his expression as severe as his father's. Silas leaned closer, examining the finer details, and then he saw it. His satisfaction curdled into confusion, and then into a cold, creeping horror. The twins, Elspeth and Anne, were not right. It was not a simple blur from movement. Their two small faces seemed to have bled into one another, their features doubled and superimposed. It looked as if two exposures had been made of them, one over the other, creating a grotesque composite, a single entity with 4 eyes and 2 mouths, fused together in a shimmering, indistinct visage. One child's face seemed to be that of a 7-year-old, while the blurred echo layered over it appeared subtly older, the features slightly more defined, as if showing her at 2 different ages at once. His breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. The rest of the plate was perfect. Only the twins were distorted in this monstrous way. It made no logical sense. A flaw in the plate, a chemical anomaly, would have affected the entire image, not just one isolated part of it. He held the plate up to the safe light, his hand trembling slightly, and as he stared at the horrifying distortion of the children, his eyes caught something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Standing behind the family, in the deep shadows of the backdrop, was a 4th figure. It was faint, little more than a whisper on the plate, but it was undeniably there. It was tall and slender, its form indistinct, its face a complete void. It had not been there in the room. Silas was certain of this. He had arranged the family himself. He had checked the backdrop. There had been 5 people in the room, and now there were 6 on the plate. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. The chemical fumes suddenly felt suffocating. The small pantry a closing trap. He fixed the image, washing it in a solution to make it permanent, his mind racing. He was a man of science, of rational thought. There had to be an explanation. A stray reflection, a trick of the light, a flaw in the polishing of the plate that had somehow created these aberrations. But the more he looked at the daguerreotype, the more convinced he was that what he was seeing was not an accident. The doubling of the twins was too specific, too detailed in its horror. The presence of the 4th figure was too definite. Its shape was too deliberate to be a random shadow. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged from the pantry, the finished daguerreotype carefully enclosed in a protective case. He found the family waiting in the parlor, exactly as he had left them, their silent patience a deeply unsettling thing. He approached them with a heavy heart, the cased plate feeling unnaturally cold in his hands. He began to explain, his voice unsteady, that there had been a problem with the exposure. He told them that the plate was ruined, that the likenesses of the girls were distorted beyond recognition, and that a strange shadow had marred the background. He apologized profusely and offered to begin the entire process again, at no charge. He was prepared for their disappointment, perhaps even their anger. He was not prepared for their reaction. Mr. Abbott simply held out his hand for the daguerreotype. Silas, confused, hesitated before handing it over. The farmer opened the case, his eyes falling upon the silver plate. He stared at the distorted image of his daughters, at the faint, shadowy figure standing behind his family, and his expression did not change. There was no shock, no horror, no confusion. There was only a quiet, unnerving acceptance. He looked at it for a long time, the pale light from the window glinting on the silver surface. Then, he closed the case. He turned to Silas and said that the portrait was satisfactory. Mistress Abbott, who had moved to look over her husband's shoulder, simply nodded in agreement, her gaze lingering on the image of the twins. She whispered that it was a good likeness, a true likeness. Silas Blackwood was stunned into silence. He tried to protest again, to insist that this was not a proper portrait, that it was a chemical monstrosity, a failure of his craft. He explained that the image was not how they had appeared in the room, that something had gone terribly wrong. Mr. Abbott calmly reached into his coat and produced the agreed-upon payment, pressing the coins into Silas's hand. He told Silas that they would be keeping the photograph. He said that the camera had seen correctly. The family's insistence was absolute, their collective calm more terrifying to Silas than any outburst of anger would have been. He looked from the father's implacable face to the mother's haunted eyes, and then to the children, who watched the exchange with a profound and disturbing stillness. There was no further room for argument. Silas Blackwood gathered his equipment, his movements now hurried, clumsy. He felt an overwhelming urge to flee the house, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the family and the impossible image he had created. As he loaded his wagon, he could feel their eyes on him from the doorway. He did not look back. He drove his horse hard, away from the isolated farmhouse, the payment for the Daguerreotype feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. He was a man of logic, but what he had seen and experienced in that shuttered parlor defied all rational explanation. He had been commissioned to capture a family's likeness, but he had instead revealed a secret, a horror that lived with them, hidden just behind the veil of normal perception, a secret the family themselves seemed determined to keep. The polished silver plate, now in their possession, was no longer just a mirror with a memory. It was a testament to something terribly and inexplicably wrong, and the quiet dread it had instilled in him would follow him for many miles, and for many years to come. The story of the Abbott Daguerreotype had just begun, and the rumors it would soon spawn throughout the small, surrounding communities would draw others into its strange and darkening orbit. The unsettling account of the Abbott family Daguerreotype did not remain confined to the troubled mind of Silas Blackwood. A man of his trade, accustomed to the predictable behavior of light and chemistry, could not easily file away such a profound anomaly. He spoke of it not in public accusations, but in hushed, fragmented warnings to fellow practitioners he encountered in the taverns and boarding houses that marked his travels. He would speak of a plate that had gone wrong in a way he could not explain, of a chemical ghost that had defied the laws of optics. He described a family that had looked upon a monstrous distortion of their own children and called it a true likeness. These fragments, dropped like poison into the well of public discourse, were all it took. Rumors began to seep through the sparsely populated countryside, carried by merchants and travelers, until they reached the small, God-fearing community that lay nearest to the Abbott farm. The story took on a life of its own, twisting and growing with each retelling. It was the tale of a spoiled photograph, a cursed image that the strange, reclusive family had paid for and kept, as if embracing a blight that any sane person would have cast into the fire. The persistence of this gossip eventually reached the ears of two men who considered the spiritual and physical well-being of the region their direct responsibility. The first was Dr. Alistair Finch, the district's sole physician. He was a man of logic and empirical evidence, his mind trained to diagnose ailments of the body, not the soul. His hands, though steady enough for the delicate work of setting a bone or stitching a wound, carried a faint, persistent tremor, the ghost of a cavalry injury from his youth, a detail that made his precise, analytical nature seem all the more a victory of will over flesh. He dismissed the rumors as the predictable superstitions of an uneducated populace. Yet, the consistency of the story, particularly the detail about the family's acceptance of the flawed image, pricked at his scientific curiosity. The second man was the Reverend Michael Clark, a man whose worldview was as rigid and unyielding as the wooden pews of his church. He was charged with the care of his flock's souls, and he saw the work of the devil in every shadow, every harvest failure, every whispered blasphemy. He had a nervous habit of removing his spectacles and polishing them with a clean handkerchief whenever confronted with a problem that troubled him, as if a clearer lens might reveal the path of righteousness. He heard the tale of the abbot Daguerreotype and saw not a chemical anomaly, but a spiritual one, a potential stain of sin made manifest. The whispers grew so loud that they became a low, continuous hum of judgment against the abbot name. Mr. Elias Abbott, a man who seemed impervious to the opinions of the outside world, finally responded, though not in the way anyone expected. He did not hide in shame or anger. Instead, he sent a short, formal note to both the doctor and the reverend, inviting them to his home to view the photograph for themselves. The invitation was not a plea for help, nor a demand for an apology. It was a simple, declarative statement of fact, an offer to bear witness. It felt, to both men who received it, like a challenge. They agreed to go together, a united front of science and faith, each seeking to impose his own order upon the growing chaos of the story. They arrived at the farm on a gray, overcast afternoon, the sky the color of slate. The house seemed to have drawn even further into itself, a silent, brooding presence against the bleak landscape. Mr. Abbott met them at the door, his expression as unreadable as ever. He led them into the same parlor where the portrait had been taken. The room was just as Silas Blackwood had described it, shuttered and dim. The air was cool and still. Mistress Abbott and the 3 children were present, standing against the far wall like a receiving line of silent judges. Their presence was unnerving. They did not offer greetings, but simply watched, their collective gaze a palpable weight in the room. Mr. Abbott produced the daguerreotype, its velvet-lined case looking somber and funereal. He placed it on the central table and opened the lid. In the faint, gray light filtering through the high window, the silver plate seemed to drink the light, revealing the image within its polished depths. Dr. Finch was the first to approach. He retrieved a large magnifying glass from his medical bag, the brass of its handle gleaming dully. He leaned over the plate, his breath misting slightly in the cool air. He examined the portraits of the parents first, noting the incredible clarity, the fine detail of the fabric of their clothes, the very texture of their skin. He murmured that the artist was clearly a man of skill. Then he moved the glass over the image of the children. A long silence followed. The doctor's hand, the one holding the magnifying lens, became utterly still, his youthful tremor for once completely absent. He peered intently at the fused visages of the twins, Elspeth and Anne. He saw what Blackwood had seen, but his clinical eye dissected the horror with a chilling precision. He noted that it was not merely a blur, not the simple ghosting caused by a child's fidgeting during a long exposure. The features were too specific for that. He explained, his voice low and academic, that it appeared as if 2 distinct portraits occupied the same space. He pointed out that one set of features, the primary one, was consistent with a girl of about 7 years, but overlaid upon it, shimmering and translucent, was another face. And this second face, he observed with a growing sense of unease, was subtly different in its proportions. The jaw was slightly more defined, the bridge of the nose more pronounced. He stated, more to himself than to the others, that it looked like the face of the same child, but as she might appear in another 2 or 3 years. It was as if the camera had not only captured her in that moment, but had also captured a faint echo of her future self, and had bound them together into a single, monstrous whole. He could find no rational explanation, no trick of light, no flaw in the chemical process he was aware of, could produce such a specific and prophetic distortion. Next, it was the Reverend Michael Clark's turn. He had been standing back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stern disapproval. He now stepped forward, his own spectacles already gleaming from a recent, vigorous polishing. He did not use a magnifying glass. His interest was not in the physical details, but in the spiritual composition of the image. His eyes were immediately drawn to the shadows, to the dark spaces behind the family where the background should have been an empty, uniform black. He squinted, leaning so close that his breath fogged the silver surface for a moment. He saw the faint, tall figure that Silas Blackwood had described, the uninvited guest in the family portrait. To the Reverend, its featureless void of a face was not merely a lack of detail, but an active and malevolent emptiness, a sign of something that had no right to a human soul. And then, as his eyes traced the edges of this spectral form, he saw something more. Etched into the shadowy backdrop, so faint as to be almost invisible, were a series of scratches on the plate. They were not random marks, they were deliberate. He could make out what appeared to be letters, and below them, a date. He traced the shapes with a trembling finger, his lips moving silently. He announced to the room that there were markings. He said he could see a date, 1810, a full 31 years before the photograph was taken. The letters were harder to decipher, but he thought he could make out a fragment of a word, a name, though he would not speak it aloud. The implications were immediate and horrifying. The plate was not merely flawed, it had been desecrated, marked with a history that predated its own creation. It suggested that the shadow figure was not a random artifact, but a specific entity, a presence with a name and a past, that had somehow intruded upon the present. The doctor and the Reverend left the Abbott house in a state of profound disturbance, each clutching a piece of an impossible puzzle. The story of what they had seen spread with even greater speed than the initial rumors, now legitimized by the testimony of 2 of the community's most respected figures. The fear was no longer abstract. It now had details. It had a prophetic distortion and a date from a generation past. The Daguerreotype became an object of intense and fearful fascination. The desire to see it, to witness the horror for oneself, became an obsession for some. But Mr. Abbott would allow no more visitors. The single viewing had been enough. With the original now sequestered, attention turned to the idea of creating copies. Dr. Finch, driven by a need to study the phenomenon under better lighting, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the Abbott parlor, arranged for a local artist, a man skilled in miniature portraits, to make a detailed sketch of the daguerreotype. The artist sat with the plate for hours, but his work was a failure. He complained that the image seemed to shift before his eyes, that the details of the twins' faces would not resolve, that the shadow in the background seemed to deepen and recede. His final sketch was a frantic, unnerving scrawl that captured the terror but none of the impossible detail. A second attempt was made, this time by another, less experienced daguerreotypist who passed through the region. He was paid by a small consortium of worried town leaders, including the Reverend, to make a copy plate from the original. The process was straightforward, a simple matter of photographing the first photograph. But the result was what solidified the object's supernatural reputation. In the copy, the deformities did not degrade, as was expected with any reproduction. They intensified. The doubled faces of the twins became clearer, their two distinct ages more pronounced and horrifyingly intertwined, and the fourth figure, the shadow in the background, was no longer a faint whisper. It was darker, its silhouette more defined. One could almost make out the suggestion of long, slender limbs, of a head tilted at an unnatural angle. This discovery sent a fresh wave of terror through the community. It defied all known laws of nature. It suggested that the evil, or the anomaly, was not a static image but a dynamic, growing presence. The act of observing it, of reproducing it, seemed to feed it, to give it strength and clarity. This was when the whispers turned from the photograph itself to the family's bloodline. The older residents began to recall stories about Elias Abbott's parents and their parents before them. They spoke of a family that had always been apart, that had a history of children born with strange afflictions, of a darkness that clung to their land. The date seen by the Reverend, 1810, was spoken of in hushed tones, with people trying to recall what tragedy or sin might have occurred in that year. The consensus began to form that the daguerreotype had not been an accident. It was a revelation. It had not created a monster. It had simply pulled back the curtain on one that was already there. The townsfolk began to say that the photograph had trapped the family's truth in silver, capturing a generational curse that the Abbotts had, until now, managed to keep hidden from the world. The plate was no longer a piece of evidence to be examined, but an active agent of the curse itself, a vessel that held their damned reality, and every copy made was a new breeding ground for the horror it contained. The community's fear and fascination had led them to probe the mystery, but each discovery had only dragged them deeper into a darkness they could not comprehend, a darkness that was now growing clearer and more defined with every fearful glance. Following the unsettling examination by the doctor and the Reverend, the Abbott family retreated into a profound and impenetrable isolation. Their world shrank to the boundaries of their own land, their presence in the nearby town ceasing altogether. They no longer appeared at the general store for supplies, nor did they attend Sunday service, an absence that Reverend Clark noted with a grim and knowing finality. This withdrawal did not quell the community's fear. It fermented it. The less the family was seen, the more they were watched. Their farm, once merely a remote property, was now regarded as a quarantine zone, a place where a contagion of an unknown nature was incubating. Neighbors would watch the smoke rise from the Abbott chimney and wonder what unnatural tableau was unfolding within those walls. Farmers tilling fields that bordered the Abbott property would find their gaze drawn to the silent, unmoving house, their imaginations populating its windows with monstrous shapes. The family's silence became a canvas onto which the town painted its most visceral fears, and the daguerreotype, though now hidden from view, had become the lens through which they were all seen. The first tangible sign that the horror was not confined to the silver plate came in the form of a subtle but persistent observation concerning the elder twin, Elspeth. A farmer's wife, a woman named Martha Corey, who lived on the next ridge over, was one of the few who still occasionally saw the children from a distance. She had known them since their birth, and her observations, later recorded in a small, leather-bound journal, provide the most cohesive account of the changes that began to take hold. She noted at first that something about Elspeth's gait seemed unbalanced, that she carried her head at a slight, unnatural tilt. Then, during a rare, fleeting glimpse of the girl at the edge of the woods, Martha saw her face more clearly. It was, she wrote, as if the two sides of her face were no longer in perfect agreement. The right side seemed to be her own, the familiar 7-year-old girl she knew, but the left side appeared subtly altered. The eye seemed a fraction higher, the corner of the mouth set in a slightly different line. It was not a grotesque deformity, not yet, but a disquieting asymmetry, a lack of harmony in her features that made looking at her for more than a second feel deeply wrong. It was, Martha realized with a jolt of ice in her veins, the exact kind of distortion one might expect if a second, slightly older face were struggling to emerge from beneath the surface of the first. The impossible blur of the daguerreotype was slowly, methodically resolving itself into a physical reality upon the child's living flesh. While Elspeth's transformation was a silent visual horror, her sister Anne's manifestation was an auditory one, a corruption of sound itself. The phenomenon began with her humming. Laborers passing near the Abbott property reported hearing a strange, dissonant music carrying on the wind, a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. It was described as a single voice singing two distinct melodies in perfect, simultaneous harmony. It was a sound that should not have been possible for one throat to produce. As the weeks turned into months, this vocal anomaly progressed from humming to speech. The few people who heard her speak during this period were left shaken and unable to properly describe the experience. One account, from a traveling peddler who had unwittingly approached the farm to offer his wares, tells of asking the young girl her name. In response, he claimed, she had spoken as two people at once. Her reply came from a single mouth, in a single breath, but it was a layered sound. One voice was that of a small child, clear and high. The other, perfectly enmeshed with it, was the voice of a young woman, slightly deeper, imbued with an unnerving, ageless confidence. The two voices spoke the same word in perfect, synchronous union, creating a chorded, resonant utterance that was utterly inhuman. The peddler fled, leaving his cart behind, later telling anyone who would listen that the child had the voice of a choir of ghosts trapped in one small body. The daguerreotype had shown two ages fused in one image. Now Anne was giving voice to that impossible union, speaking for both the child she was and the person she was becoming. The most terrifying development, however, was the emergence of the fourth figure from the shadows of the silver plate into the material world. It was never seen clearly, never confronted face to face. It existed only in the periphery, a fleeting perception of wrongness that haunted the edges of the Abbott family's movements. The sightings were always at a distance, often at dawn or dusk when the light was weak and the shadows were long. A farmer, hurrying home as the sun set, saw the Abbott family walking in single file along a dirt path on the horizon. He counted them, a father, a mother, and 3 children. 5 figures silhouetted against the dying light. He blinked, his eyes watering from the wind, and when he looked again, there were 6. A tall, impossibly thin shape walked behind them, its movements fluid and unnatural, a column of darkness that seemed to drink the twilight. It did not walk like a person, but drifted, keeping a constant, unnerving distance from the family. The farmer did not wait to see more. He turned and ran. The image of that extra, silent companion burned into his mind. Another sighting was reported by a group of boys hunting rabbits near the Abbott's land. They saw the family moving through a grove of birch trees. The dappled light made them appear and disappear between the white trunks. But as they watched, they noticed that one of the shadows that moved with the family did not belong to any of them. It was too long, too slender, and it bent at angles that defied the position of the sun. It clung to them, an unholy appendage of darkness, a 6th shadow for 5 bodies. They said the air grew cold as it passed, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The journal of Martha Corey became the most detailed chronicle of this escalating dread. Her entries, penned by candlelight in a shaky but determined hand, mapped the town's descent from gossip into a state of genuine, communal terror. She wrote of her own fear, a fear that was intimate and personal. She had once brought a small pie to the Abbotts after the birth of the twins. She had watched the children grow. Now, she wrote only of what she saw from her kitchen window, which overlooked the valley where the Abbott farm lay. She documented the slow, creeping asymmetry of Elspeth's face. She described hearing Anne's double-toned voice on the wind, a sound she compared to a broken church organ. She recorded the second-hand accounts of the sightings of the fifth walker, the shadow that was more than a shadow. In one particularly lucid entry, she grappled with the central, horrifying question that now plagued them all. She wondered if the daguerreotypist, Silas Blackwood, had brought a curse upon them with his strange box of chemicals and light. Had his process somehow invited this darkness in, forcing the family into this monstrous new shape? Or, she posited in a passage that was barely legible from the trembling of her hand, was the alternative even more terrible. She asked if the daguerreotype had been a revelation, not a curse. Had it simply been the first thing to see the truth that was already there, hidden within the family's bloodline, gestating in silence for generations? Was this horror not a new development, but an ancient inheritance, finally blooming into view? The photograph, she concluded, was not shaping reality. It was merely a mirror that had been polished enough to reflect the family's true and monstrous soul. The community could no longer bear the weight of this unfolding horror. The evidence was no longer confined to a single, cursed object, but was now walking the fields and speaking on the wind. The children, once the subject of pity, were now seen as the active agents of the blight. Their physical and vocal changes were accelerating, becoming more pronounced with each passing week. The sightings of the tall shadow figure grew more frequent, more brazen. Fear had curdled into a desperate primal need to act, to purge the evil before it could spread beyond the borders of the Abbott farm. The Reverend Michael Clark, seeing his flock consumed by a terror that prayers alone could not soothe, decided that a more direct intervention was required. He, along with Dr. Finch and a small, grim-faced group of landowners, made a decision. They would go to the Abbott farm not as observers, but as exorcists. They did not carry torches or pitchforks. Their weapon was a singular, focused conviction. The source of the affliction, the heart of the curse, was the daguerreotype. It was the anchor that tied the supernatural horror to the physical world. They believed that if the original plate could be destroyed, the connection might be severed. The family might be freed, or at the very least, the growing contagion might be contained. Their journey to the farm was not an invitation this time, but an incursion. They went to demand the destruction of the image, to erase the silver-plated truth that was now rewriting the world in its own monstrous image, a decision that would lead them not to a resolution, but to a confrontation with the true, unyielding nature of the horror they faced. The decision to destroy the Abbott daguerreotype was born of a desperation so profound it felt like courage, led by the rigid conviction of Reverend Michael Clark and the reluctant pragmatism of Dr. Alistair Finch. A small delegation of the town's most prominent men made their way to the isolated farm. They carried no weapons, only the unassailable conviction that they were acting to excise a cancer from the heart of their community. Their arrival was met not with resistance, but with a silent, unnerving acquiescence. Mr. Elias Abbott received them at his door, his face a mask of grim resignation, as if he had been anticipating this confrontation for a very long time. He led them into the parlor, the same room that now felt like a stage for some recurring, terrible play. Mistress Abbott and the children were present, their transformations now starkly, undeniably visible in the weak afternoon light. Elspeth's face was now so profoundly asymmetrical that she appeared to be two different people crudely stitched together. Anne stood beside her, humming her impossible, two-toned melody, a sound that seemed to make the very air in the room vibrate with unnatural resonance. The shadow that clung to the family seemed to have been drawn indoors with them. The corners of the room were unnaturally dark, the space behind the silent family a pool of profound blackness. Reverend Clark, his voice straining to remain steady, made their purpose known. He spoke of the unnatural blight that had fallen upon the family and the town. He spoke of the daguerreotype not as a portrait, but as a cursed icon, a focal point for a malevolent force that had to be annihilated. He demanded that Mr. Abbott surrender the plate so that it could be properly and sanctimoniously destroyed. To the surprise of the delegation, Mr. Abbott did not argue. He did not defend his right to the object. He simply crossed the room to a small wooden chest, unlocked it, and retrieved the velvet-lined case. He held it for a moment, his gaze fixed upon it, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps sorrow, perhaps something far more complex, passing across his features. Then he handed it to the Reverend. The transfer felt ceremonial, a handing over of a sacred and deeply profane burden. The delegation, emboldened by this easy victory, chose to perform the act of destruction then and there, on the abbot's own land, as if to prove their dominion over the evil that resided there. They took the daguerreotype out into the barren yard in front of the farmhouse. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of gray cloud. The family followed, watching from the porch, their stillness a silent, unnerving counterpoint to the men's determined action. One of the men, a blacksmith named Thomas Kane, had brought a heavy hammer. He placed the cased photograph on a large, flat field stone that served as a makeshift anvil. The Reverend said a short, forceful prayer, his words swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the countryside. Then he nodded to the blacksmith. Thomas Kane, a man whose strength was a local legend, lifted the hammer. He brought it down with a powerful, resounding blow, expecting the delicate silvered plate and its glass covering to shatter into 1,000 useless fragments. The sound of the impact was a sharp crack that echoed across the fields, but the result was not what they had expected. The glass of the case shattered, yes, sending slivers flying, but the plate itself did not. It broke, but cleanly, into 3 large, distinct shards. A gasp went through the small group of men as they looked down at what they had done. Each fragment of the broken plate still held a portion of the image, as clear and defined as before. One shard held the stern, unblinking faces of Mr. and Mistress Abbott. Another held the image of their son, Samuel. And the third, the largest and most horrifying of the pieces, contained the fused, monstrous portrait of the twins, Elspeth and Anne, with the faint, dark shape of the fourth figure looming directly behind them. The horror had not been shattered. It had been multiplied. The single curse had become 3, each piece a perfect, concentrated vessel of the original blight. A frantic, fevered energy now seized the men. Their initial righteous certainty had been fractured along with the plate. The Reverend, his face pale with a mixture of fear and fury, declared that fire was the only answer. The devil's work, he proclaimed, must be cleansed with holy flame. They gathered dry wood and kindling, piling it high around the stone where the shards of the daguerreotype lay. Dr. Finch, a man of science, watched this descent into ritualistic panic with a growing sense of dread. He saw not a holy exorcism, but a mob succumbing to its most primal fears. Yet he did nothing to stop them. He too felt the cold, undeniable wrongness of the unbroken images in the fragments. He too felt the desperate need for this to end. They set the pyre ablaze. The flames leaped up, orange and hungry, consuming the dry wood with a fierce roar. The heat was intense, casting flickering, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the unmoving, silent figures of the Abbott family still watching from the porch. The men watched the fire, their faces illuminated by the inferno, their expressions a mixture of hope and terror. They were certain that nothing could survive such a conflagration. The silver plate would melt, the chemical image would be burned away, and the curse would be reduced to ash and smoke. The fire burned for over an hour, a raging beacon in the gray twilight. When it finally died down to a mound of glowing embers and white ash, the men approached cautiously, using long sticks to sift through the remains. The fieldstone was blackened and cracked from the heat. Everything else had been incinerated. But there, in the center of the ashes, lay the 3 shards of the Daguerreotype. They were untouched. The fire had not melted them, had not scorched them, had not even discolored their polished surfaces. If anything, the intense heat seemed to have cleaned them, making the images they held even more stark and vivid against the blackened ruin of the pyre. The faces on the fragments stared up at them from the ashes, their expressions seeming to mock the futility of their efforts. A collective moan of despair rose from the men. Their attempt at destruction had been an utter and absolute failure. It was as if the object was not made of earthly materials at all, but was an idea, an entity that could not be unmade by simple physical force. The whispers that had circulated through the town now seemed like undeniable truths. The family was bound to the plate, and the plate was bound to a power that fire and iron could not touch. That night, a different kind of fire visited the Abbott farm. Whether it was an accident, a stray ember from the failed exorcism, or a deliberate act of arson by the now terrified and enraged townspeople, no one could ever say for certain. A traveler on the main road just before dawn reported seeing a pillar of flame on the horizon in the direction of the Abbott property. By the time anyone from the town arrived, the farmhouse was a roaring inferno, a funeral pyre that consumed the entire structure. The heat was so intense that no rescue attempt was possible. They could only stand and watch as the home, and presumably the family within it, was consumed. The fire burned until there was nothing left but the stone foundation and a single, blackened chimney stack, standing like a tombstone against the morning sky. The community felt a grim, terrible sense of relief. The horror was over. The family, the house, the curse, all of it had been wiped from the earth in a final, cleansing fire. A few days later, Reverend Clark and Dr. Finch returned to the ruins, a grim duty to search for remains and to officially close this dark chapter in the town's history. They walked through the ash and charred timbers, the silence of the place profound. They found no bodies, no bones, nothing to suggest that 5 people had perished in the blaze. It was as if they had simply evaporated in the heat. But as they picked through the debris in the area where the parlor had been, their search came to a sudden, chilling halt. There, lying in the center of a patch of strangely undisturbed ash, was the Daguerreotype. It was whole again. The 3 shards were gone, and the plate was once more a single, unbroken object. It lay face up, its silver surface gleaming amidst the universal blackness of the ruin. The image it held was the same, yet subtly, terrifyingly altered. The family was there, but the shadowy 4th figure behind them was now clearer, its form more solid, and etched into the glass above its featureless face. A new impression had appeared, faint but legible, the date of the fire. The pastor, upon seeing this, fell to his knees, his faith shattered into more pieces than the plate ever had been. He understood now that they had not been trying to destroy an object. They had been trying to destroy a record, a living history that documented its own survival. He began to whisper that the family was not gone, that they had simply been absorbed into the plate, their physical forms shed to join the eternal, captured horror within. He claimed that the fire had not destroyed them, but had merely been the final act required to complete their terrible ascension, forever binding their bloodline to the indestructible silvered curse. For decades, the story of the Abbott family and their cursed daguerreotype receded from living memory into the realm of local folklore. The burned-out foundation of their farmhouse was slowly reclaimed by nature, the black stones sinking into the earth beneath a tangle of weeds and wildflowers, a scar on the landscape that only the oldest residents could still identify. The daguerreotype itself vanished. After its miraculous survival in the fire, it was taken by a terrified Reverend Clark, who, according to the scant records that remain, sealed it within an iron box and had it buried in an undisclosed location, hoping to entomb the horror forever. The tale became a ghost story, a cautionary fable whispered to children about the strange family who had been consumed by a picture, their truth too terrible for the world to bear. The physical evidence was gone, and with the passage of generations, the visceral terror it had once inspired softened into a quaint, historical superstition, a dark little footnote in the region's past. The object, however, was not destined to remain buried. The world changed, the small, isolated community grew, and land that was once considered remote wilderness was eventually surveyed for development. In the early part of the 20th century, sometime around 1922, a construction crew unearthed a small, heavily rusted iron box while digging the foundations for a new municipal building. Inside, nestled in the rotted remains of what might have been velvet, was the daguerreotype. It was perfectly preserved, its silver surface untarnished by the long years of damp and darkness. The image it held was as clear and as disturbing as the day it was created. The local authorities, having no context for the strange, unsettling portrait, treated it as a historical curiosity. It was eventually donated to the county's nascent historical archive, a place of dusty shelves and forgotten records, where it was cataloged and filed away, its monstrous history reduced to a single, neatly typed index card that read simply, "Daguerreotype of unidentified family, circa 1840. For nearly 50 years, the Abbott daguerreotype lay dormant in a climate-controlled drawer, a silent prisoner in an archive of forgotten things. It was occasionally handled by junior archivists or bored interns, most of whom noted its strangely unsettling quality but thought little more of it. It was simply one of many strange, somber faces from a bygone era. That changed in the autumn of 1972, when a graduate student from a distant university arrived at the archive. His name was Julian Croft. He was a bright, intense young man, his long hair and worn corduroy jacket a stark contrast to the staid, musty atmosphere of the county records office. Julian was a student of early photographic anomalies, and he had a particular, almost obsessive interest in the technical imperfections of the daguerreotype process. A brief, passing mention of a flawed, possibly composite family portrait in the archive's catalog had drawn him there. He had a nervous habit of constantly pushing his spectacles up the bridge of his nose, a gesture that bespoke a restless, analytical mind. The head archivist, a woman named Eleanor Vance, remembered him well. She recalled his initial academic excitement as she retrieved the plate for him, the way his eyes lit up as he saw the strange, doubled visages of the twins. Julian Croft became obsessed. He spent every day for 3 weeks in a small, sterile viewing room, the daguerreotype his sole companion. He photographed it from every conceivable angle, made hundreds of pages of meticulous notes, and created dozens of detailed sketches in his notebooks. Eleanor Vance would see him working late into the evening, the single lamp on his desk casting a small pool of light in the otherwise dark archive, his face pale and drawn, his focus absolute. He was a man possessed by a puzzle. He told Eleanor that the anomalies on the plate were unlike anything he had ever seen, He explained that the doubling of the twins was not a simple motion blur, but a technically impossible superimposition of two distinct moments in time. He became fixated on the shadowy fourth figure, which he referred to in his notes as the observer. He began to claim that its form was not static, that its position and clarity seemed to shift subtly between viewings. Eleanor dismissed his growing agitation as the product of academic pressure and a lack of sleep. She was wrong. One rainy Tuesday morning, Julian Croft did not arrive at the archive. His table in the viewing room was empty, save for his notebooks and sketches, left open as if he had just stepped away for a moment. He was never seen again. The local police conducted a perfunctory investigation, but found no evidence of foul play. He had simply vanished. His car was still in the parking lot of his motel. His wallet and identification were in his room. It was as if he had walked out of his life and into thin air. It was only after the investigation was closed that Eleanor Vance, while packing up his abandoned research materials, took a closer look at the final sketches in his notebook. The drawings were frantic, almost unhinged, a departure from his earlier precise and academic style. They were all of the fourth figure, but in these last sketches, the figure was no longer the faint, indistinct shape seen on the plate. Julian had drawn it as a fully realized entity. It was depicted as a tall, gaunt adult, its limbs unnaturally long and jointed, its face still a featureless blank. In the final, most disturbing sketch, he had drawn the figure stepping out from the background of the portrait, its long, shadowy hand reaching towards the viewer. Beneath this drawing, Julian had scrawled a single, frantic question. He said he wanted to see, "What have I shown him?" The disappearance of Julian Croft cast a new, modern pall over the Abbott Daguerreotype. The archive, spooked by the incident and the unnerving contents of the students' final notes, officially retired the object from public viewing. It was sealed in a new, acid-free archival box, and a restriction was placed on its file, ensuring that it would not be handled again without the express permission of the county director. The official explanation was that the plate was too fragile for regular study. The unofficial reason, whispered among the staff for years to come, was that the photograph was malevolent, that it had somehow consumed the brilliant young man who had stared too long into its silver depths. The plate itself seemed to confirm this. Before sealing it away, Eleanor Vance documented a new, impossible alteration to the image. In the deep shadows near the edge of the frame, a new face had appeared. It was incredibly faint, little more than a suggestion, but under high magnification, one could just make out the features of a young man with longish hair, wearing spectacles. The story, however, does not end in a sealed box in a dusty archive. In the age of digital reproduction, the Abbott Daguerreotype found a new and insidious form of immortality. Before Julian Croft's disappearance, he had taken dozens of high-resolution photographs of the plate. These images, stored on a roll of film in his abandoned belongings, were eventually developed and, years later, found their way onto the internet. Scanned and uploaded to forums and websites dedicated to paranormal photography and unsolved mysteries, the image began to circulate, freed from its physical prison. And with each new digital copy, each share, each download, the old horror reawakened. People who viewed the image on their computer screens reported the same unsettling phenomena that had plagued observers for over a century. They claimed the faces of the twins seemed to shift and blur. They insisted that the shadowy figure in the background grew clearer, more defined, the longer they stared at it. Some even claimed to see new, faint faces appearing in the dark corners of the image, faces that hadn't been there before. The Daguerreotype, an artifact from a bygone era, had proven itself to be horrifyingly adaptable. It no longer needed a physical plate to exist. It now lived in the light of a million screens, a viral ghost in the machine. The hidden horror revealed in a farmhouse parlor in 1841 was not a relic of the past, but an eternal, patient predator, carried across the centuries from silver to celluloid to pixels, forever seeking new eyes to see it, and perhaps new observers to consume. The case file on the Abbott family daguerreotype remains open, not because the mystery is unsolved, but because each new reproduction, each new viewing, risks reawakening the full, terrifying potential of what was once captured, and what now seeks its final, complete release.